Kamen Rider is one of the longest-running television shows in history. Spanning 40 years, the series has developed and changed over time. And while the modern Heisei Riders are a lot different from their Showa-era counterparts, we must remember what made the Showa era special. And that was that they not necessarily used fancy technology like lock seeds, shift cars, and Gaia memories, but that they used their own skills. That they didn't fight necessarily with weapons, but with their own techniques and powers. That they necessarily did not have the best of lives, but they wanted to become good as opposed to evil, as they've seen what evil has done to ruin the world. Those heroes fight for justice, and I want to pay tribute to them over the next 15 weeks as we review every SH Figuart of the Showa-era Kamen Riders. This series will begin with Kamen Rider 1 and end with Kamen Rider Black RX. And throughout this series, I'll also include 3 honorary riders, the Shocker Rider, Tackle, and Shadow Moon, as they would fit in as being Kamen Riders for a modern day. While they weren't considered Kamen Riders in their time, I feel as though they'd earn this distinction and should be considered Kamen Riders. We begin with Rider 1 of Technique, Kamen Rider Ichigo. It's known as Kamen Rider 1 in his Shin Ichigo form in this SH Figuarts release. Now, this is the first release of Kamen Rider 1 in the SH Figuarts line. Later on, we did get the other versions of Rider 1, known as Old Rider 1, and the secondary Rider 1 that appeared after his intense fighting in Europe. Now, this version of Kamen Rider 1, also known as Hongo Takeshi, is, of course, the version that we typically see now in the crossover movies and appearances since the original series. It didn't appear till later on in the original Kamen Rider show, but it has lived on further in specials like Kamen Rider Tyson, All Riders vs. Die Shocker, and Ultraman vs. Kamen Rider. Rider 1 himself, as an SH Figuart, is quite fantastic, being the silver-gloved and booted version of the character. The silver paint that Bandai loves using has made the figure really pop. It's quite awesome how much detail has been put into it, especially when it comes down to the eyes. Now, while the eyes in the series did look quite nice, the eyes on the Figuart look a little bit nicer, kind of matching the more modern style of the segmented Kamen Rider eyes. The head sculpt is quite perfect. It's one of the best. It's not too stylized. It looks just like the Shin Ichigo helmet. You even have a scarf here, which is molded very nicely, down to the Typhoon belt, which just looks cool. As you can see, there's a small scratch that does happen from time to time if your Figuarts are gravity prone, like mine. The double stripe on the side of his arms and legs continues all the way down his body, and is really nicely painted. No paint issues at all with this guy. That's really nice and appreciated. No paint is missing. I love the sculpting on the belt with the old style belt connection. Overall, the sculpt for the figure and the detail is awesome. It is probably one of the best Figuarts detail-wise. Now, of course, what is a good Figuart without articulation? And this articulation of this figure is completely unrestricted. Now, the tricky part when it came to making the Showa Kamen Riders, because they aren't as armored as the modern-day Heisei Riders, is that the articulation in the shoulders will get a little weird because of the more cloth suit. Now, as you can see, they managed to keep the sculpting detail relatively well. When you do move his shoulder, it will disconnect the lines a little bit, but this did allow for him to have full shoulder range. His arm will move as much as a normal human's would, and that's pretty darn cool. He also has the double-jointed elbows, the triple-jointed wrists, the standard Figuarts articulation we've come to know and love, being able to move like a human can, and no further, but in some cases like this, a little further. I love these kind of joints that allow for an extra higher kick type pose. It is really cool. Plus, double-joint knee that works really smoothly, and even though it uses a ball-jointed ankle, it's got quite a bit of range to it, which is really nice and appreciated, but it does have its limits. Even a little toe joint to add extra flair. So posing Rider 1 in classic Shocker fighting poses is possible, but does look a little weird if you're just posing him with fists. And that's where alternate hands come into play. Rider 1's hand assortment is quite fantastic, having palm open hands, some gripping hands to use for motorcycles, some relaxed open hands, and of course his classic henshin pose hand. The posing options increase with the new hands, especially this one here, pulling off the classic Rider 1 henshin pose and victory pose, which allows for this special hand, which has the thumb brought into the palm of the hand, because that is how you pull off the pose. And the articulation does suffice enough to have his arm pull off his classic pose, which is super important. But also, since he's already kind of halfway there, we gotta pull off a rider kick. And in order to pull off a rider kick, you can't just have a guy putting his leg up attached to a Tamashi stage. You need a little bit of an effect part. Having a rider kicked effect piece is super important because while this does look quite cool and dramatic, especially with this alternate flowing in the wind scarf piece, the effect part for Rider 1 just makes the effect perfect. Even though the effects in the original series aren't as advanced as the modern shows, this still gives it the edge to help Rider 1 defeat Shocker. And when it comes down to it, the rider kicked effect looks awesome, and it does fit the feel of the Showa-era Kamen Riders series. The final accessory for Kamen Rider 1 is a Shocker sword. For those that have not watched the original Kamen Rider series, which they're sorely missing out, they wouldn't exactly know about how Kamen Rider 1 liked to take the weapons of the Shocker grunts that he had defeated. A Shocker combatant would carry around weapons a lot, and Rider 1 would take them. So this inclusion of the sword is quite awesome, and I really like that they added it in. Plus, when you have a Shocker Combat Man Figuart to go with it, it kind of completes the effect. But overall, how is SH Figuarts Kamen Rider 1? SH Figuarts Kamen Rider 1 is a fine example of what a SH Figuarts Kamen Rider figure should be. He comes with enough hands to pull off signature poses, in addition to coming with enough accessories to make those poses really work. Despite the figure being 3 years old, it doesn't feel dated even in 2014. After all the Kamen Rider Figuarts have come out in the last 3 years, Rider 1 still feels like one of the best. Very few have topped him in terms of quality, articulation, accessories, and accuracy to the character. I find really no flaws with the figure overall, and I'm glad that it got a re-release with his new Cyclone bike. So overall, I would highly recommend Rider 1, and if you can't find the single release, I definitely recommend getting him with the new Cyclone. SH Figuarts bikes are always nice, and this is definitely a figure you need to own in your collection if you are a fan of Kamen Rider and collect the SH Figuarts line. Now, if you don't want to get the Shin version, the other two versions are relatively identical base mold-wise. They're just some slight head variations and paint differences. But I feel as this form has appeared the most, Shin Ichigo is the way to go when getting a Rider 1 Figuart. So I am perfectly happy with this figure, and I've had it for several years, and is one of my favorite Figuarts of all time. Dare I say, one of my favorite action figures of all time. And it's a great way to kick off the Showa Rider legacy. Now, Rider 1, of course, came first, but Rider 2 came second. How similar is SH Figuarts Kamen Rider Shin Nigo to Shin Ichigo? And stay tuned, as next week we will be reviewing SH Figuarts Kamen Rider 2. Tungsten Soundout saying goodbye.